Hello, everyone, and welcome to WFMT's Classical Conversations, in which we have the pleasure of talking with the most engaging people in classical music and the arts, and in the case of today's conversation, with two students of American history. I couldn't be more thrilled for today's classical conversation presented in connection with Ken Burns' newest documentary, Benjamin Franklin, premiering on all WTTW platforms on April 4th at 8 p.m. Central. Today, I have the honor of interviewing actor and historian Mitchell Kramer, who has been portraying Benjamin Franklin for more than a decade. I'll henceforth refer to him as Dr. Franklin, and Ellen Cohn, editor-in-chief of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin and senior research scholar in the Department of History at Yale University. She has written and lectured widely on various aspects of Franklin's activities, including his love of music. Before we begin, major support for the WTTW presentation of Benjamin Franklin comes from Rita and John Canning and Marshall Field V, and our members, which helps us fulfill our purpose to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Ellen Cohn and Benjamin Franklin, welcome to Classical Conversations.
Thank you so much.
My first question is, what do we know of Benjamin Franklin's early interest in and exposure to music? What was he listening to as a young man in his formative years? Could we start with you, Ellen?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's a hard one to really pinpoint. But Franklin grew up in Boston in the early decades of the 1700s. And I think, there weren't concert halls. It wasn't like Europe. He would listen to great European composers later in his life, but in these early formative years, his father played violin and sang psalm tunes and hymns at home. And most of what Franklin would have been hearing in his early days would have been music being played by family members in the home context, I think.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Franklin, what are your early memories of listening to music?
Oh, well, thank you so much. Ellen's quite right. It was in the home where I was most inspired by music. My father not only played violin and sang, but he sang beautifully. And evenings at home were often spent listening to him. And in fact, he encouraged all of us to take up music and eventually accompany him, which we had the chance to do. Not just my father, but my mother. But it's true, we did not have large concert halls in Boston at that time. We would have heard predominantly folk songs, popular tunes, and of course, religious hymns were very important in my childhood home, though not so much in our childhood church, where such things were discouraged.
Dr. Franklin, you invented many things. Too bad you didn't invent the radio. Then great classical music could have been widely dispersed even earlier through such platforms as WFMT. We know that the late 18th century was an incredibly rich period for music in Europe, what we now refer to as classical music. And we've talked about it a little bit, but what was the scene like in what we now know as America at that time? There were very few concerts, and I don't think operas really made it to our shores at the time that Benjamin Franklin was a young man.
Was certainly not as a young man. In fact, I think generally it is though we are now coming much further ahead in my life, it was, I believe, my godson, Francis Hopkinson, who may have written America's first opera, though I'm not sure how often you perform it any day. We would, of course, in my day have thought of that as modern music, what you call classical music. And we did not see much of it. I, of course, had gone to England at the age of 18 years old, 19 years old. And so I would have more exposure to your modern music then.
We know that Franklin invented many things. Among his inventions was a contraption that we can still hear today called the glass harmonica. And as a matter of fact, many people at holiday gatherings have done a kind of their own version of the glass harmonica, the moistened finger around a wine glass. But can you describe the instrument that Benjamin Franklin put together? Ellen, let's start. What's your impression of this instrument?
Well, Franklin in London, when he was stationed in England as a representative of the colonies, he heard some really outstanding musical glass performers. And you're quite right. The idea was you had crystal glasses filled to a certain height with water so that they were perfectly tuned. And then you rubbed your clean finger along the rim, and the friction made a tone. And the sound was enchanting, and there were some really excellent players that Franklin heard. But he, being Franklin, thought to himself, you know, it's a lot of trouble to rub your fingers around each and every glass. And more than that, if you want to change notes, you have to hop from cup to cup. And if it's a hot day and the water is evaporating quickly, you're going to go out of tune pretty fast. And so what he did was to say to himself, how could we make this better? And he invented a way of blowing glass bowls and tuning them. You can imagine how difficult this was. And he wrote very explicit directions for how to blow these cups or bowls. And the idea was that they were graduated in size. From large to small, and they fit inside each other. The idea being that you wouldn't have to put your fingers around a rim. The rims would turn and you would just put your fingers on the rotating rims and play this like a keyboard. So have the glasses move. Don't move your fingers. To achieve this took a lot of trial and error, and he was immensely proud of the product. So his first glass harmonica was 3 octaves, and it had many advantages that he wrote about, including that you could sustain notes. As these bowls turned, they were connected through the center by a bar, so that it was kind of like a rotisserie, and they turned via a foot treadle. So you would have them rotate, wet your fingers, and then as you placed your fingertips on the moving rims of these glass cups, a tone would be produced that people described as ethereal, celestial ravishment of the ear was what one person called it.
I'll have to remember that. But we don't have to just talk about it. We have an example. Let's watch and listen to this video. This is a little-known composer, J.J.S. von Holt-Zombach, and this is an Allemande from his first suite for glass harmonica. John, would you roll the video, please?
That was delightful.
Isn't that a marvelous sound? Now, Ellen said that this was one of Benjamin Franklin's favorites of his own inventions. Dr. Franklin, how do you feel about this today, listening to your invention?
Oh, yes, of all of my inventions, it's the one that has given me the most personal satisfaction. I should say, only add, it is true, I had heard people playing the glass. In fact, we had a gentleman come to the Royal Society of London when I was there and play the rims of glasses. Devil, for the life of me, I cannot remember the man's name. But what you saw there is rather remarkable. I had a gentleman by the name of Mr. Charles James, create my glass harmonica, which I still have up on the 3rd floor in the music room. And it is in a case, in a wooden case. That one was open, which is interesting. And eventually I was able to create one with as many as 37 graduated glasses. So it had quite a range. But perhaps what's most important is what Ellen said about the spindle that the glasses revolve around. This notion of a spindle being powered by a foot pedal, or even later perhaps powered by electricity, is something you will see over and over again. I, of course, did not have the skills to create the apparatus, but they are delightful. But you will see in many of the apparatus that I design, this repeating, turning spindle. And of course, the foot pedal as well, you'll see in a number of my apparatus.
Mozart wrote music for the glass harmonica, as did Donizetti. He used it in the famous Mad Scene from Lucia di Lammermoor. Usually, the instrument that's used in the opera is a flute, but originally Donizetti used a glass harmonica. Wasn't the glass harmonica rumored to induce madness in listeners?
Yeah,
oh,
absolutely.
Well, yes. No, it's very, you should also note in that little piece that you played, you would note that the bowl of water that sat on the instrument, it's very important that one wets their fingers with clean, fresh water from a small bowl and not from touching them to their tongue and then the crystal glass. Very important.
Yes, and if I could jump in here, I was honored to be invited to speak to the first ever conference of an organization called Glass Music International. This had to have been around 1990 or so, I really can't remember, but every glass harmonica player in the world, and you can just imagine how many that was, were there in Boston for this conference. And I showed them this manuscript, which we have, which is Franklin's directions for how to get a good tone. It's very, I don't know how many of your listeners will have ever tried to play one. It's very hard to get a good tone. And so Franklin wrote out directions for people to read. And just as Dr. Franklin was saying, you have to wash your hands very carefully so that there's no grease at all. And then the other very important element is what kind of water do you use? Now, I don't know, I used to, many years ago, I had as a roommate a classical bassoon player. And if you've ever been around woodwind players, you know that as soon as they get together, all they talk about is reeds.
Reeds.
Reeds. They could go on for hours. You get 5 bassoon players in a room and that's all they talk about. Well, at this conference, I quickly caught on to the fact that what kind of water you use is sort of a trade secret. So I went around from player to player and said, you know, I'm not a threat. I'm not a performer, but tell me what kind of water you use. And there was a huge variety of answers, which were just fascinating. Franklin in this manuscript advocates rainwater.
Huh?
Now, some people use distilled, some people use tap water. They say it doesn't make any difference. Some people say hard water with minerals gets the best tone. Other people say soft water is better. One player called me aside and looked around furtively to make sure no one else was listening and let me in on his secret. 2 drops of lemon juice.
Interesting.
A little acidity.
And I realized that I've now broken the promise that I made to him all those decades ago. I swore that I would never reveal that. But anyway, there's a wide variety of feelings about this. But I think the key thing is, as Franklin wrote in this manuscript, to make sure there's no grease at all on your fingers, because otherwise it won't get the right friction and you won't be able to get those beautiful sustained notes and make them sound when you put your fingertips on the glasses.
It occurs to me.
Of playing is, if you put your fingertips on, will it sound immediately or not?
It just occurred to me, I don't know if there's any contemporary music written for glass harmonica, but someone should commission Philip Glass, of course, to write a piece. Before we move away, because this instrument is so fascinating, let's watch I mentioned the mad scene from Lucia di Lammermoor. We have a very, less than a minute clip. So we can watch a performance that features the soprano Nadine Sierra and hear how the glass harmonica is almost used as a voice that she's hearing in her head. John, could we play that Lucia clip, please? And isn't it interesting that in the production, they have glasses, crystal glasses filled with varying levels of liquid. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I just love the visual as we're hearing the glass harmonica in that scene from Lucia di Lammermoor with Nadine Sierra.
George, could I add one little thing here?
Please.
How lovely it was of you all to choose that clip to hear a voice with the instrument. And I'm sure that our friend Dr. Franklin will remember that during his lifetime, one of the most celebrated performers in Europe was a young woman named Marianne Davies, who got tutored by Franklin and toured Europe playing the harmonica. And then her younger sister began touring with her as a singer. And they worked hard so that the vocal quality matched the sound of the harmonica as closely as possible, so that the two kind of blended into this gorgeous sound. So singing and the harmonica were linked from early on.
Well, Dr. Franklin, what are your memories of the sister act?
Yes, and the largest of the hemispheres would have been tuned just below the common voice. So this idea of it accompanying singing, but this is of course why you mentioned young Mozart, and I'm sure we'll speak of Dr. Mesmer later in his relationship with young Mozart's father, but the harmonica is really more of a parlor instrument to be accompanied by a singer than you would hear it in a large orchestration. I think it is, well, you said it yourself, I think of that ethereal quality, and this lends itself to accompanying especially a woman of such skill as Miss Davies. But of course, the key to what we've just spoken of is that they were women. And this was an opportunity, and we will see over and over again that there are not enough opportunities for women to make a large impact in many of the fields that I have found, and yet we see them do that nonetheless. And music is certainly a place where over and over again, we see in my lifetime, women making extraordinary contributions. There was some concern over the health qualities of the young women being exposed to the instrument, but that of course was all unfounded, I assure you.
I want to make sure that I remind our audience that if you have questions for Dr. Franklin or for Ellen Cohn, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will save some time at the end of this session for your questions as well. I meant to say that at the outset, but yes, any questions at all, we'll save time to address those towards the end. And before we move away from the glass harmonica, let's talk about the connection. Dr. Mesmer was a big fan of this instrument and was known to Mozart and is actually referred to in Mozart's Così fan tutte.
Yes, I think perhaps, well, Ellen, perhaps you'll speak of this. I think perhaps young Mozart was a greater fan of Dr. Mesmer than I myself was. Our experiences together, especially our time together in my garden, was not to his liking. Would you like to expand on that, Ellen?
Well, that could be a whole hour in and of itself.
Yeah, exactly.
But at this time, just quickly, Anton Mesmer came to Paris during the period that Franklin lived in France. He was kicked out of Austria, so he took refuge in France and then convinced huge numbers of people that he could cure them by means of manipulating harmonic fluid in the body. It was a whole theory that he had. And our term mesmerism, of course, is derived from him. And he would have seances in very darkened rooms where he would put his hands on the legs of the young ladies and stare deeply into their eyes. And all of a sudden they would find themselves experiencing sensations and being cured of whatever it was that they came to be cured of. But the medical establishment in France was very concerned about this because Mesmer was getting astronomical fees and refused to divulge his theories to the medical community. So Franklin is very famous in the history of science for having headed a commission appointed by the King of France to investigate Mesmer's practices. And the big, amazing takeaway from the 4 months of experiments was that Mesmer's magnetic fluid, animal magnetism they called it, didn't exist. They proved that by means of experiments. These were the first double-blind experiments. It was an incredible commission. But Benjamin Franklin also realized that there was something going on. And so at the same time this commission proved that Mesmer's theories were wrong and that this fluid did not exist. It also proved the power of the human mind, they called it imagination, to create sensations in the body. And so what we now know of as the placebo effect was also demonstrated by these experiments. But that's getting apart from music.
Yes, a little bit, yes. Dr. Franklin, you were not the only founding father with an interest in music. Thomas Jefferson, we know, was a skilled violinist. And we've mentioned Francis Hopkinson, who was the composer of a song that became very, very famous, "My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free." Is there any evidence in the historical record that these founding fathers compared notes, so to speak, or that they shared their impressions about music?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, of course, Thomas is what, 35, 36, almost 40 years younger than me. And though there was a very brief period where we overlapped in France, and he seemed to recall discussing some new instruments at that time. But Francis is different. Francis Hopkinson, of course, who also signed the Declaration of Independence, was my godson. His father was one of my dearest friends. He's, in fact, the first person to have graduated from the college that I helped to found. And he and I spoke of music often. He not only aided me in he attempted to repair an harpsichord that I had in my house, which my daughter Sally played, and Francis and my daughter were very close friends. But he also often sat as the organist at my wife's church, at my church, the Christ Church. So Francis and I spoke often of these things. And whenever he would compose a new ballad, oftentimes during the war, he would send me a copy. And one of his ballads, many of them became very popular. Now, oftentimes he would compose the lyrics and we would put it to a popular tune. So, for example, one that your listeners may be most familiar with would be the Battle of the Kegs, which was a very popular tune, which you would have accompanied with the tune Yankee Doodle Dandy. And he sent me a copy of that. It's very delightful. But other than that very brief overlap in France, I cannot think of any occasion I had to discuss music with young Tom. Ellen, am I incorrect in my remembrance?
Oh, well, you may have forgotten.
What I have forgotten could fill a library.
Probably the library that is right behind me. I just filled a book about you. Franklin, we're kind of talking about Franklin's relationship with music, but if I could just now, to segue into this answer, emphasize the fact that of all the different kind of musics that Franklin heard, he played many instruments. We've got documentation about that, but he also loved to sing. And he loved to sing songs. This being St. Patrick's Day, I've got to tell your audience that Franklin loved nothing more than to be in a tavern, lifting a glass and singing drinking songs with his friends. Now, he wrote 2 drinking songs that are really good. Oh. And I've actually sung them with great success to tens of people in my lifetime. They're witty, they're funny, and one of his best friends in France, who was a great economist and a cellist and a music devotee, they had long conversations about music. And that man, the Abbé Morellet, wrote a drinking song for Frank that is I don't know, 18 verses long, hilariously funny, that he presented to him as a gift at a July 4th party during the Revolution. But all that to say, Franklin wrote 8 or 9 songs during his life. They were really wonderful. He knew what made it, and he wrote very intelligently about what he thought made a good song. Maybe we can come back to this later, but to answer the question about Francis Hopkinson, long after the war, at the end of his life, one of the things he was proudest of was that Francis Hopkinson composed and had published a book of songs that he had written. I think it was called 7 Songs, despite the fact that there are 8 in the book, but that's another matter. And Franklin was so proud of the fact that finally an American had composed what he called American music that was created in the new nation. And he sent copies of that book to 2 of his very best friends in France.
Well, you bring me to another.
If I could just, I'm sorry. I just, she mentioned the drinking song, and she's absolutely right, from Andre Morlaix. And Andre was a very close friend, and we spent a lot of time together. And I actually have, I'm not going to read you, I have a copy of Andre's drinking song devoted to me. And one of the lines is, now this of course was written in French, and I've taken the liberty of translating it to it. But one of it was, he discusses how the war came about, and he suggests that it was, and then of course this is coming from my good French friend, that it was for our champagne that we went into this campaign, suggesting that perhaps all along the American Revolution was so that we could have greater access to French wines.
Oh, absolutely. The fight for independence is to drink the wines of France. And it goes on and on and on, just making, well, it was the kind of witty, charming, funny event that made his gatherings in France so wonderful. And the chorus, this song has a chorus, which everyone can sing. Glasses in hand. Let's sing to Benjamin, which is in French, if I might. Le verre en main, glasses in hand, chantons notre Benjamin. And then they go on to a verse. So as the evening went on, people got tipsier and tipsier, and I'm sure the laughter was uproarious.
Absolutely.
Since we're talking about a possible cause of the American Revolution being access to great French wine, let's talk about the role of music in the American Revolution. Did Franklin and his contemporaries use music to further the cause of American independence in any way? I mean, we see this happening in so many struggles around the world throughout history, where music is used as a force for change.
Ellen, would you like to tackle that first?
Would you like to avoid tackling it?
Well, I said the Battle of the Kegs.
You know, here's the thing. Songs were really important for the soldiers. And I've read a number of diaries written by American soldiers in which they talk about coming to camp in the evening and the songs that were sung. Some of these songs are ones that I know for a fact Franklin knew, because he mentions them. These were the folk songs of the day. Now, Dr. Franklin has already mentioned the tune Yankee Doodle. All of these things were really important to the people fighting. But in terms of Benjamin Franklin himself, we have to remember that he spent the entire war overseas. So he had a completely different role, and he wasn't that involved in in that kind of endeavor. He did, among the songs that he wrote in the run-up to the Declaration of Independence, he did write songs about independence, but you know, I don't have any evidence that they spread very far or were terrifically influential.
Yes, I would just add that both of those examples we gave, Yankee Doodle and Battle of the Kegs, are about sort of the notion of turning seemingly losses into gains. That is to say, taking some of the wind out of the sails of the British Army. In the case of the Battles of the Kegs, this would have been a battle that we could never have fought, and yet we make fun of the British for having wasted so much time against our harmless kegs. In the case of Yankee Doodle, we take a tune that the British would have been very common with, and these terms, the Yankee, the macaroni, and all of these things that they would have spewed onto us as criticism, and turn it around as something positive.
I want to let our viewers, our audience know that you can join WTTW on March 31st at 6 p.m. to preview selections from the Ken Burns film, Benjamin Franklin, along with Paris Schutz, who is co-anchor of WTTW Chicago Tonight. Paris will moderate a conversation with the film's producer, David Schmidt, Rabia Mayas, PhD, Vice President of Education at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and Jason Coleman, co-founder and executive producer at Project Sincere, discussing Franklin, the scientist and the inventor. So we know that in his early life, Franklin heard folk songs, songs in taverns, perhaps, some church music, but then he went to Europe, where there was a much more cultivated musical life, shall we say. What kind of documentation do we have on Franklin's activities as a concert goer when he was working in Europe? What was in his ear at this time?
Ellen?
Well, what we know has to come from the letters that he wrote. And so I feel that he must have attended many more concerts than we know about, but we know that he did attend them. When he was in London, for example, Handel was the rage. And he was at that point transitioning from, I think, his Italian concertos, are they, to oratorio form.
Yeah, he wrote a lot of Italian operas and they ceased to be commercially viable. So he pivoted to writing oratorios.
Yeah. And so Franklin attended a number of those, and we know that. We have a reference to his having gone to a performance of Messiah.
Oh, yeah.
And I know for a fact that he was very familiar with Judas Maccabeus, another one of Handel's oratorios. The reason that I know that, can I tell you about this? And reach over to one of the books that he published?
Please.
There is an amazing letter that Franklin wrote to his brother, that the manuscript of this letter doesn't survive. Thankfully, Franklin thought enough of it that he had it published in his major work, which is called Observations on Electricity. This was the work in which he exposed or publicized his experiments and made him arguably the most famous, well, certainly the most famous American in the world, one of the most famous people in the world. But in this book is a letter about music that he wrote to his brother, Peter, who had sent him the lyrics of a ballad and asked Franklin's advice on what kind of tune to set it to. And Franklin wrote back this really fascinating analysis in which he said, you know, your meter is way too complicated. It's never gonna fit a simple tune. You could do no better. If you want a melody for a ballad, you could do no better than to walk into the woods of Massachusetts and find a girl who had heard nothing other than, and then Franklin names 3 classic ballads from the English and Scottish tradition. Children in the Woods, Spanish Lady, and one more. And he had a whole theory of why these melodies were the most pleasing in the world, which we could talk about later if you want. But in terms of concertizing, he then went on to write what has to be a parody, but there is a kernel of truth in it, in which he says the problem with the current vogue of art music is that the voice imitates instruments. All this vocal technique is very impressive, but does it really speak to the soul? Now, your listeners, there are millions of people in the world who will testify that it does. But to Franklin, it didn't so much. And he went on to say that in his view, songs were meant to communicate. A song is a melodious way of speaking. And if you can't understand the words, then there's a big problem. And this is very typical of him. Once he puts forth an idea that's pretty serious, he then turns it into a joke and makes you chuckle, which is the rest of this letter, in which he analyzed 5 what he called defects in Judas Maccabeus.
My goodness.
And the reason I got this book out is that although we don't have the manuscript, I don't know whether you all can see, but he actually writes out the passages that he's talking about.
He cites the musical examples.
He cites musical examples for each of these defects. Now, just to give you an idea, one of them is when a certain syllable keeps on repeating in the word. Let's just say, papageno. This is stuttering. And he has several examples of that. One example that he cites is where the soprano makes a leap of over an octave, and he calls it screaming without pause. So you see that this is all meant to make you smile and laugh, but the point he's making, he actually really believed that for vocal music, he wanted to make sure that you could understand the words. And if you couldn't, then that wasn't what vocal music was supposed to be. Now, an interesting question is, how is it that Franklin could write out these musical examples? And in fact, he owned the scores for almost every single oratorio that Handel produced.
So in some sense, while he had his criticisms of what Handel was doing, Dr. Franklin, you're a fan of Handel on some level, I have to think, if you own the scores.
Yes, it's in my case. I have the letter. I should be clear that Ellen is referring to a letter to my brother Peter, as I have many brothers. So we'd be clear. So I'll just read it. Humility often keeps me from doing such things, but I'll read just the very last sentence of the postscript to this letter that she refers to, in which I say, if ever it was the ambition of musicians to make instruments that should imitate the human voice, that ambition seems now reversed. the voice aiming to be like an instrument. Thus, wigs were first made to imitate a good natural head of hair, but when they became fashionable, though in unnatural forms, we have seen natural hair dressed to look like wigs. And I think it is the same thing we are seeing perhaps in what I would refer to as modern music. It's no longer attempting to imitate the instrument, but rather the other way around. And of course, what we're speaking of is nature and the relationship between nature and music, the relationship between the instrument and nature and this form of imitation. And I would suggest perhaps that in our singing, in our instruments, we are always in our own way attempting to imitate nature. And when we fail, we find ourselves with stuttering and inarticulation and screaming, as you would. Oh, I dropped it on the floor. Forgive me.
That's quite all right.
Oh.
Franklin is
315-year-old man bending over. Sorry.
You're quite spry for your age, I must say.
You're very kind.
Franklin is said to have composed a string quartet around 1778 while living in Paris. I want us to talk about that in just a moment. But first, John, can we hear, I don't think we need to hear much, maybe 40 seconds or so of this string quartet, please. Yes, I think that'll do it. Not the best string quartet I ever heard in my life, if I may say. So I hope, Dr. Franklin, I'm not insulting you, but is there any real evidence to suggest that that came from the mind and the pen of Benjamin Franklin?
So as I understand it, that particular piece was an experiment in an attempt to I don't remember exactly, what was it, 2 violins and 2 viola instead of 3 violins and 1 viola, is that correct? And it does appear that someone affixed my name to it. I'm afraid whoever attempted to ascribe this particular musical piece to me misspelled my name. And I have very rarely done that. I cannot remember any instance when I have misspelled my name, certainly not since the age of 4. So I take no credit for that particular piece of music, as interesting as it may seem.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Well, I think one of the reasons why so many people, it's true that one of the existing manuscripts of this piece of music has Franklin's name on it. The other 2 don't. And so one question to always ask in a situation like this is, why did people think it was so believable that Franklin could have written it? If he did write it, which I don't think he did. In fact, I'm quite certain he did not. But this claim that he wrote it in 1778 in France is just completely impossible as far as I'm concerned. But here's why, as a concept, I think it had legs, is because this piece was written for amateur string players. And it requires, there's a term for this called scodatura, I think. And what it means is, I think it's actually scored for 3 violins and a cello.
Mhm.
But what it is each instrument is retuned
Oh, yes.
so that each open string is tuned to a specific note. And the player just has to bow one of the 4 open strings without fingering.
No fingering at all. Ah, yes.
And therefore, it's a curiosity. The challenge is with 4 instruments and 4 notes apiece, that gives you a total of 16 notes. And the challenge is, can you make anything halfway interesting with 16 notes? If it sounded to your listeners a little bit repetitive, that's because it is. And I don't think it was composed by any kind of genius. And it's such an appealing idea that Benjamin Franklin would have wanted to get a group of people together and just bow open strings.
I certainly there was certainly no share of, I made my fair share of mistakes in my life, and there is nothing more delightful than a experimentation, whether it fails, a challenge. My 3-face clock might be an example. There are other examples of things. I am always happy to take credit for failed attempts. There have been no shortage. I attempted to electrify a river once. That didn't work out very well. But this particular little folly, as we would, I can take no credit for. There were a lot of interesting things going on in France in 1779, the early 1780s, perhaps more important than musical experimentation for me personally.
We do have a couple of audience questions to get to, and I encourage you, if you're in the audience, you can drop a question in the Q&A or in the chat. One comes from Peter, who asks,
"Oh, my brother."
Well, I'm not sure. The last name is not Franklin. Were the founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, at risk of being executed if they had been captured by British forces during the Revolution?
Depending on the time, yes, most certainly. There was some danger on one of my voyage to France. We felt at one point that we may be being followed by British forces and had to take a different route. In the very beginning of the revolution, I actually met with the commander of British forces and his brother in New York on their ship. So they gave us passage. I had actually been friends with General Howe prior to the war. Once I was in France, I don't think there was too much danger, but for many of my contemporaries, the danger was very, very real. There were, in fact, some founding fathers who did not survive to the end of the war. Others, many who had to flee their home. We see founding fathers hide. We see one who hides in a cave at one point. We see at the Battle of Princeton, we see, I think it was Mr. Livingston had to flee his home. So yes, the danger was quite real.
And another question for both of you, and I'll diverge from referring to you as Dr. Franklin for this one, Mitchell Kramer. Ellen and Mitchell, how did you become interested in Benjamin Franklin, and why did you decide to focus on him professionally?
Ellen?
I fell into this completely by accident. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll just give you the very short version. As a young scholar, I was given the opportunity of working with the team of people who were publishing all of Franklin's papers from manuscripts that had been collected from all over the world. And I discovered that I had a passion for this kind of work, and I never left. So I personally can think of no individual that would have induced me to stay for more than 40 years working on his papers. Franklin is endlessly fascinating, and his correspondence, which we're publishing, is not just what he wrote, it's what everybody wrote to him that we've been able to find. So it's a window on the whole 18th century.
And Mitchell, what about you?
So I have to actually, Ellen really sort of captured it in a sense. I fell into this accidentally as well. I had degrees in theater and history and moved back from New York to Philadelphia, where I began to explore American history and 18th century history, as I had explored many other subjects. I had done some performances regarding history with museums. When it was suggested that I take over the role of Benjamin Franklin from a previous Benjamin Franklin interpreter, I was delighted because, like Ellen, there is very few subjects that can continue to engross one year after year after year, and one can continue to find more. So if one was interested in the history of medicine, there is no better subject than Dr. Franklin. If one is interested in the history of music, or the history of politics, or the history of science, or the history of clockmaking, or the history of water, or the history of sports, there is very few subjects that I have ever come across that encompass the entire width of 18th century history, as does Benjamin.
Well, the time has flown by. I want to thank you, Dr. Franklin, also known as Mitchell Kramer, and Ellen Cohn for joining us today. And as a reminder, Ken Burns' newest documentary, Benjamin Franklin, premieres on all WTTW platforms on April 4th at 8 p.m. Central. Major support for the WTTW presentation of Benjamin Franklin comes from Rita and John Canning and Marshall Field V. Please join us on Tuesday, March 22nd at 11 a.m. Central Time for a Bach to School virtual assembly featuring Chicago Musical Pathways Initiative. WFMT presenter and producer Robbie Ellis will interview James Hall, project director of CMPI, and young violinist Esme Arias Kim. In addition, please mark your calendar for our next classical conversation on Thursday, April 21st at 12 noon. This classical conversation is in conjunction with The Birth of Gospel, the newest documentary on WTTW's website. It'll be one of our Chicago stories. This will premiere on WTTW on Friday, May 6th, the documentary itself. WFMT presenter LaRob K. Raphael will interview Dr. C. Charles Clancy, music educator, author, and the last accompanist of Mahalia Jackson. Information about these upcoming WFMT events are available on our website, WFMT.com. Thanks to Tim Russell, John Wilmot, and Keegan Morris for their participation and assistance. Mitchell and Ellen, thanks again to you. And thanks to all of you who joined us. Until next time, please take care.